What if I told you that everything you believed about the gastronomic delights of the past has nothing to do with the reality of London streets? Victorian London is often portrayed as a city of gloomy sidewalks, strict manners, and cold ballrooms, but real life was bustling elsewhere. It was bustling around smoky braziers where thousands of people gathered in the rain and fog, seeking not culinary pleasures, but basic warmth. It was a world where food was not a luxury, but a salvation. Simple, hot, and vitally necessary. These streets were dominated by cuisine that the aristocracy preferred to ignore. Here, dishes were sold not for enjoyment, but for survival in conditions where the cold penetrated every home and every coat. Workers, sailors, porters, all flocked to the steaming stalls where, for a few pennies, they could buy boiling water, hot offal, potatoes, and pies with fillings that were difficult to identify at first glance. This food was rough, cheap, but filling, and it literally kept the huge metropolis going. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how simple hot coals wrapped in rags replaced hot water bottles for the poor, why potato peelings were considered almost a delicacy, and how London's street food became a secret but vital mechanism that helped thousands of people stay warm in the frozen heart of the empire. What if I showed you a time machine that looks like a rusty tin can, but works more efficiently than a modern heater? In the mid-19th century, the streets of London were filled with amazing contraptions that resembled steam engines rather than kitchen utensils. Baked potato vendors used massive metal cabinets on wheels, equipped with smoke pipes and special compartments for coal. These mobile ovens were true masterpieces of poor people's engineering, created from materials at hand. A constant high temperature was maintained inside, turning hard tubers into soft, steaming food. The glow of hot coals at the bottom of such a machine attracted passers-by from afar, promising salvation from the dampness. The potatoes themselves were selected with particular care for such trade, with preference given to large and starchy varieties. The tuber had to be large enough to serve as a full meal for an adult man, tired after a shift at the docks. Before baking, the potatoes were thoroughly washed and sometimes cut so that the heat could penetrate to the very core. The cooking process took a long time, but the result was worth the wait in the cold. The skin became hard and crispy, securely holding the hot, crumbly flesh inside. It was the perfect natural heat storage device that could be put in your pocket. The buyer received their order not on a plate, but directly in their hands, which was critically important in frosty weather. The hot tuber first warmed frozen fingers, acting as a pocket warmer, and only then became food. The vendor deftly cut the steaming potato in half with a single stroke of his knife. A generous pat of butter was placed inside, which melted instantly, saturating the flesh with a golden liquid. Salt and black pepper were sprinkled on top, creating a simple but rich flavor. The aroma of baked potatoes mixed with the smell of burning coal was one of the most recognizable signs of the city in the evening. These machines appeared on street corners at dusk when workers were returning home. Competition among vendors was fierce, so everyone tried to make their oven as bright and attractive as possible. Copper parts were polished to a shine so that they would reflect the light from the gas lamps and attract attention. Some vendors even decorated their carts with colored glass, creating the illusion of a holiday. For many Londoners, buying such a potato was the only hot meal they had all day. In cold rooms without heating, such food helped to keep the body warm before bedtime. It was the most democratic fast food of the era, requiring neither cutlery nor a table. You could eat on the go, continuing your journey through the thick fog. The simplicity of this dish is deceptive, because behind it lay a perfect adaptation to the harsh conditions of urban life. Surprisingly, it was this humble product that became a symbol of street comfort during the Industrial Revolution. People gathered around potato ovens not only for food, but also for socializing. The light from the coals illuminated faces in the darkness, creating a temporary island of safety. Here, people discussed the news, shared rumors, and simply sat in silence, enjoying the warmth. The vendor acted as the host of this small street club. Interestingly, the price of such potatoes could vary depending on the size of the tuber and the time of day. Late at night, when the cold became unbearable, the value of hot food increased many times over. However, merchants rarely overcharged, knowing that their customers counted every penny. Stability and reputation were more important than short-term profit. Regular customers knew who had the best baked potatoes and who had the freshest butter. The merchants themselves spent 12 hours on their feet, constantly keeping the fire going in their braziers. Their faces were blackened and their hands were roughened from constant contact with hot metal and coal. But their craft was respected and provided a stable income that allowed them to feed their families. They were an integral part of the nightscape, guardians of fire in the concrete jungle. Without their smoking machines, the city would have seemed a much more hostile and cold place. Today we are used to complex dishes, but back then, happiness was measured by hot starchy pulp and melting butter. This food did not require decorations or complex sauces. It was honest and straightforward. It embodied the essence of survival, finding warmth where it seemed to be absent. The potato steamroller was a small miracle, accessible to everyone. And this miracle saved not only from hunger, but also from the loneliness of a cold night. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such simple food as a way to warm up? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about a product that is now considered a symbol of luxury, but was once the food of the poor? Oysters in the Victorian era occupied a completely different place in the food chain than they do today. They were harvested in huge quantities off the coast and were incredibly cheap. Even people who couldn't afford a piece of meat could afford a dozen oysters. The streets were literally littered with empty shells that crunched under the feet of passers-by. Oyster stalls stood at almost every busy intersection and near markets. They were simple wooden tables, often lit by a single candle protected from the wind by a paper cap. The vendors worked with incredible speed, opening the shells with short knives. Customers did not take the oysters home, but ate them right at the counter, standing up. It was a kind of ritual, quick snack that replaced a full dinner. The taste of the shellfish was sharp and salty, reminiscent of the cold sea. To soften this taste and make it more intense, the merchants offered simple seasonings. There were always bottles of cheap vinegar and peppermills with black pepper on the counter. The buyer generously poured vinegar over the oyster and sprinkled it with pepper before putting it in their mouth. Sometimes a piece of coarse bread with butter was offered with the oysters to make the meal more filling. The freshness of the product was the main criterion for quality, but hygiene standards were very different from today's. The oysters lay in the open air, washed by city dust and soot. However, the cold weather served as a natural refrigerator, keeping the shellfish alive for quite a long time. People believed that oysters gave strength and improved health, which was important for hard physical labor. It is interesting to observe how the perception of food changes over time and with the development of the economy. What fishermen used to throw away as surplus is now served on ice in expensive restaurants. But back then, it was just a protein food, an affordable alternative to beef or pork. A worker could eat a couple of dozen oysters at a time just to fill his stomach. It wasn't a delicacy, it was fuel. Oyster merchants often worked in tandem with sellers of other seafood, creating small fish markets. Pickled shellfish or boiled shrimp might be sold nearby. The smell of fish, vinegar, and the sea overpowered even the ubiquitous smell of coal smoke. In the evenings, crowds gathered around such stalls, attracted by the opportunity to eat cheaply. The demand for oysters was so great that supplies flowed into the city continuously. Railways and river barges brought tons of shellfish every day. It was an entire industry that fed thousands of people, from collectors on the shore to street vendors. Oyster fever swept through all strata of lower society. However, by the end of the century, the situation began to change due to the depletion of natural reserves. Prices crept up, and oysters slowly began to become an elite product. But in the middle of the era, they were still the kings of street food. Their accessibility made them a unique phenomenon in urban gastronomy. This paradox of food history makes us think about how we value products. Cost is determined not by taste, but by rarity and difficulty of extraction. Victorian paupers ate what millionaires ordered today without even suspecting their wealth. For them, it was just food that allowed them to live to see another day. Today, it is difficult to imagine that oyster shells were once trash lying in the sewers. But history loves such ironic twists and turns. Oysters have gone from street dirt to silver trays. Do you love seafood or think it's overrated? In the next chapter, you'll learn the secret ingredient that turned ordinary fish into a gelatinous lifesaver. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of traditional London dishes? In the murky waters of the Thames lived a creature that became the staple diet for thousands of East End residents. We are talking about eel, a fish that was easy to catch and cost next to nothing. Baked eel was not just food, but a real cultural phenomenon in working-class neighborhoods. This dish looked unusual, but it had unique nutritional properties. Preparing jellied eel was a process that required patience and knowledge of proportions. The fish was cut into small pieces and boiled in water with vinegar and spices added. The secret was that eel released a huge amount of natural gelatin when cooked. As it cooled, the broth solidified into a thick, transparent jelly that enveloped the pieces of fish. No artificial thickeners were needed. Nature itself had created the perfect recipe. Sellers of this delicacy stood with large metal trays or bowls. The jelly trembled with every movement, reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. A serving was inexpensive and was often served in small bowls or even on a piece of paper. The taste was rather bland, so a special sauce played a key role. Liqueur was the name given to the green sauce made from parsley, vinegar, and water, which was generously poured over the dish. The contrast between the hot mashed potatoes, which were often served as a side dish, and the cold eel jelly created an interesting texture. This combination of hot and cold, soft and firm, was the hallmark of London's poor cuisine. Vinegar helped digest fatty fish and killed any possible river water tastes. Parsley added at least some vitamins to the meager diet of city dwellers. Eels were so popular that there were entire shops specializing in this dish. Inside such establishments, the walls were lined with white tiles and the floor was covered with sawdust. But street trading remained the most common way of consumption. Workers ate eels for lunch, dinner, and even as a snack between shifts. Many believed that eel had healing properties and helped with joint diseases. In a damp climate and with hard labor, this belief had a practical basis. Fatty fish provided energy, and gelatin was indeed beneficial for bones and ligaments. The intuitive dietetics of the people found useful foods through experience. Visually, this dish could scare off the unprepared. Gray pieces of fish in transparent slime did not look very appetizing, but hunger is the best cook, and the nutritional value of eel was undeniable. For many generations of Londoners, this taste became the taste of home and stability. The eel trade flourished as long as the Thames remained clean enough for the fish to live. Vendors bought live eels by the basketful, and they wriggled, demonstrating their freshness. This spectacle alone attracted the attention of passers-by, serving as a living advertisement. The freshness of the product was guaranteed by the very vitality of the fish. Today, pickled eel has become a rarity and a nostalgic attraction for tourists, but back then, it was a staple of survival, an affordable source of protein from the nearest river. This dish teaches us that humans are capable of finding resources literally under their feet, or in this case, in the murky waters of the city river. The history of aspic eel is a story of adaptation to the urban environment. People used what nature gave them, even if nature was confined to stone banks. It was an honest collaboration between man and river. Like this if you would risk trying this historic dish. What if everything you were taught about what is edible and inedible became obsolete in the face of Victorian necessity? On the streets of the city, you could find merchants selling what we would today call meat production waste. Sheep's feet, or trotters as they were called, were a popular and extremely cheap delicacy. They were carefully cleaned of wool, boiled until tender, and sold straight from baskets. It was a dish that required a certain skill from the eater. The process of preparing trotters was long and laborious. First, they had to be singed and scraped until they were white so that they looked presentable. Then they were boiled for hours until the tendons and skin turned into a soft, sticky mass. The result was a product rich in collagen and protein, albeit with little meat. Buyers valued this stickiness and richness. The merchants were often women or elderly people who were unable to do heavier work. They sat on low stools, covering their goods with clean white cloth to show respect for the buyer. The whiteness of the cloth contrasted with the dirt of the street, creating an illusion of cleanliness. Risaki were usually eaten cold, held by the bone like a handle. Sometimes hot broth in which they were cooked was offered with the legs. This broth was thick, rich, and warmed you up perfectly in cold weather. It was poured into mugs and drunk on the spot, accompanied by bread. It was a waste-free cycle where every calorie was put to good use. For many poor people, sheep's feet were the only opportunity to taste meat. Even though they were just cartilage and skin, they gave a feeling of fullness and strength. You could chew on such a leg for a long time, prolonging the pleasure. It was a kind of activity that distracted from thoughts of the cold. The taste of the trotters was improved with the help of vinegar and salt. The acid in the vinegar softened the fat and made the taste more vivid. Some gourmets added mustard if the seller had it. The simplicity of the seasoning emphasized the natural taste of the product. Interestingly, this food was considered quite decent for a snack on the go. Workers, clerks, and even small traders did not disdain buying a couple of legs for lunch. It was convenient. No dishes were needed, hands remained relatively clean, and the bones were simply thrown away. Utility was the main requirement for street food. Competition forced sellers to carefully select their goods at slaughterhouses. The meatier and cleaner the legs were, the faster they sold out. An experienced merchant knew how to choose the best specimens from a pile of scraps. This required a professional eye and knowledge of anatomy. Sheep's feet disappeared from the streets along with the improvement in the quality of life. Today they remain only in old cookbooks as a reminder of times of austerity. But back then, they were a lifesaver for those who could not afford tenderloin. This dish demonstrates the nose-to-tail principle in action. Nothing should go to waste if it can provide energy. People knew how to find value even in what seemed useless. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how roasted chestnuts replaced heating? Roasted chestnuts were perhaps the most romantic and atmospheric type of street food of that era. With the onset of cold weather, vendors appeared on every corner with iron braziers filled with smoldering coals. The sweet, smoky aroma of roasted nuts wafted through the neighborhood on the wind. This smell became an integral part of winter in London, a harbinger of Christmas and the holidays. The brazier was a simple design, a metal bowl with holes mounted on a tripod. Charcoal burned underneath, providing a gentle, even heat. On top was a baking tray or grate on which glossy brown nuts were scattered. The vendor had to stir them constantly so that they did not burn but roasted evenly. Before roasting, each chestnut had to be cut with a knife. This was done so that the nut would not explode from the internal pressure of the steam when heated. The sound of the shell bursting and the quiet hissing created a special soundscape on the street. These sounds promised warmth and a delicious treat. Chestnuts were sold in paper bags, usually by the dozen or half dozen. The hot bag pleasantly warmed the hands, and buyers often did not rush to eat, enjoying the warmth. Peeling the chestnut from its hard shell and thin inner film was part of the ritual. Fingers turned black from coal dust, But no one was bothered by this. The taste of roasted chestnuts was sweet, mealy, and filling. They were an ideal source of carbohydrates, providing quick energy. In addition, chestnuts were relatively inexpensive, as they grew in abundance. They were often bought simply as a treat to brighten up the long journey home. The light from the brazier illuminated the vendor's face and attracted passers-by. In the thick fog, these red dots of fire served as a kind of beacon. People came to warm themselves, exchange a few words, and buy some nuts. They were islands of warmth in the cold ocean of the city. Chestnut sellers were often Italian immigrants or elderly locals. They knew how to choose the right coals that smoldered for a long time and gave off good heat. The ability to maintain the right temperature was a real art. Overcooked chestnuts became hard as rocks. Undercooked ones became bitter. The chestnut season was short but intense. It began in late autumn and ended after Christmas. This gave the product a touch of seasonal joy. People waited for the appearance of braziers as a sign of the changing seasons. Even when people didn't have money for a full meal, they almost always had a few pennies for chestnuts. It was a small luxury available to the poor. The feeling of a hot nut in your mouth in the cold was priceless. Chestnuts remain popular today, retaining their appeal. But in the Victorian era, they were more than just a snack. They were a symbol of warmth, light, and simple human pleasure in the midst of a harsh winter. What if I told you that the first cup of coffee was a matter of survival rather than invigoration? Before dawn, when the city was shrouded in thick fog, coffee stalls appeared at the crossroads. These were not fashionable coffee shops, but simple carts with large tin cans under which oil lamps burned. Their customers were workers going to their shifts, market traders, and night watchmen. For them, this hot drink was the only way to wake up and warm up. At that time, coffee was more of a remedy for the cold than a customary morning ritual. The stalls appeared as if out of nowhere, like part of the night city. The vendors knew that the first crowd would gather before sunrise. They prepared coffee in huge containers, where the drink stood all night on low heat. The fog absorbed the sounds, and from a distance it looked as if small lights were flickering in the cold haze. This created the impression that the stall was the only living place on the empty streets. The coffee served there was far from the refined Arabica varieties. It was a thick, dark liquid, often mixed with chicory or burnt sugar for color and strength. The taste was harsh, bitter, but scalding hot. It was diluted with large amounts of milk, and sugar was added to increase the calorie content. Such a drink was not meant to be tasty, but effective. Sometimes vendors added a little spice to mask the smell of cheap beans. There were days when the coffee was too strong and almost burnt, but no one complained. People drank it in large gulps, trying to feel the warmth inside as quickly as possible. One sip revived the body, as if someone had lit a fire in the chest. That's why workers returned to the stalls every morning. Along with coffee, they sold thick slices of bread with butter or simple muffins. The bread was cut coarsely and the butter was spread in a thin layer, but for a hungry person, it was a full breakfast. Sometimes they offered boiled eggs or pieces of ham. The main thing was to get the energy to start a hard day's work. The food was simple but provided reliable sustenance for long hours of labor. Many people bought food on the run, trying not to waste a minute. Workers and merchants did not have time for long breakfasts, so the stall provided a quick and affordable option. Sometimes the seller would set aside a portion for a familiar customer, knowing that they would show up at the same time. This is how a special mutual care was formed. Morning breakfast became a small but important ritual. The atmosphere around the coffee stall was special. In the pre-dawn mist, by the light of a dim lamp, people of different professions gathered. The steam from hot coffee mixed with people's breath and the fog. The clinking of mugs and quiet conversations broke the morning silence. The stall was a small island of life in a sleeping city. Sometimes you could hear more here than in any square. People shared news, discussed the weather, and argued about politics. Night watchmen passed on rumors they had heard while on duty. Merchants talked about what would be at the market in the morning. In such a close-knit atmosphere, the city began to wake up long before dawn. Coffee sellers knew their regular customers by sight and often sold them goods on credit until payday. This created a relationship of trust and made the stall an important social hub in the neighborhood. Here you could find out the latest news or find a part-time job. For some people, the seller became almost a friend. Such relationships strengthened the sense of community. The stall was also a place where you could forget your problems for a while. A conversation with the vendor or a familiar customer lifted your spirits. For a few minutes, it felt like life wasn't so hard. These brief encounters helped people cope with the harsh working conditions. Coffee became a reason for human contact. The mugs were heavy, ceramic, with thick walls to keep the drink warm longer. They were washed right there, in a bucket of water, which did not add to hygiene, but sped up the process. Speed of service was important, as people had to hurry to work. No one paid attention to the imperfect cleanliness. The main thing was warmth and the opportunity to rest a little. Sometimes the mugs cracked from constant heating, and the sellers kept spares on hand. But even such damaged mugs were used until the very end. Customers were calm about this because they came not for aesthetics, but for function. Any mug that held a hot drink was considered good. All this reflected the harshness of the times. The price of a cup of coffee was minimal, which made it affordable for the poorest segments of the population. It was an alternative to gin, which was often drunk to warm up, but which ruined health. Coffee provided clarity of mind and warmth without intoxication. It helped people stay productive throughout the day. Therefore, such a drink became not a luxury, but a necessity. Sometimes the authorities tried to restrict the sale of alcohol and promoted coffee as a healthier alternative. Coffee stalls became an important part of urban culture. They kept people from harmful habits and created a space for early socializing. This made coffee part of the urban rhythm. People understood its benefits not only physically, but also morally. The red light of a lantern on a coffee stall was a sign of hope in the darkness. It promised warmth, food, and human company. For the homeless and vagrants, the smell of coffee was a painful reminder of unattainable comfort. But even they would sometimes warm their hands over a warm can if the vendor was kind. The light from the lantern seemed like a small beacon in the vast emptiness of the night. That light had seen more stories than many of the city's buildings. It reflected the faces of people who struggled for their lives every day. It became a symbol of early mornings, hard work, and hope. The stall served as an anchor, keeping people grounded in reality. It helped them survive the coldest and foggiest nights. At sunrise, the coffee stalls closed and disappeared, giving way to daytime trade. They were night dwellers, ghosts of the fog. But their role in the life of the city was enormous. They greeted the first people of the day and gave them strength for work. With their disappearance, the usual city noise began. The vendors left, leaving behind a faint smell of coffee that lingered in the air. The streets gradually came to life, and what had seemed mystical at night became mundane. But those who had seen the stalls in action knew their true value. They understood that without these points of warmth, the morning would be much harder. This is how the first connection between the drink and work arose. Coffee was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, starting people's engines every morning. Without this black liquid, the city would have had a much harder time waking up. How do you start your morning? In the next chapter, we will look at the art of selling, which made people buy even what they didn't need. In a world of growing trade, this skill became almost as important as the product itself. Street trading required not only good merchandise, but also outstanding acting skills. The sellers, known as cockerels, were masters of verbal genre and visual presentation. Their cries and calls were a kind of music on the streets of London, each with its own unique melody and rhythm. They had to shout over the noise of carts, the clatter of hooves, and the voices of competitors. The display, even if it was just a simple wheelbarrow, was arranged with great care. Apples and oranges were polished with cloth to a mirror's shine so that they would sparkle in the sun. Fish were laid out on fresh green fern leaves or damp cloth to emphasize their freshness. Pyramids of vegetables and fruit were built with architectural precision, creating a sense of abundance. Fire merchants used clever lighting in the evening. Candles or lamps were placed so that the light passed through translucent objects or reflected off glossy surfaces. This made the goods more attractive and appetizing, hiding minor flaws. The art of light was a primitive but effective marketing ploy. Verbal techniques had also been honed over the years. Vendors used rhymes, jokes, and even small theatrical scenes to attract the attention of the crowd. They addressed passers-by as old acquaintances, flattered women, and joked with men. The ability to strike up a conversation was the key to successful sales. There was a system of signs and slang that only insiders understood. Vendors could exchange information about the police or wealthy customers without interrupting their trade. It was a closed community with its own laws and hierarchy. The vendor's clothing was also part of the image. Many wore bright neckerchiefs, vests with mother-of-pearl buttons, or distinctive caps. This set them apart from the gray crowd and made them recognizable figures in the neighborhood. Special attention was paid to demonstrating the quality of the goods. A vendor might cut a fruit in half to show its juicy flesh or offer a piece of cheese to taste. Tasting was a powerful tool of persuasion that was difficult to refuse. The psychology of pricing also played a role. Goods were often sold in bunches or by weight, using clever measures of volume. The art of bargaining was a mandatory skill for both sides. Shopping turned into a small competition of wit. At the end of the day, when the market closed, prices fell sharply. This was the time for the poorest buyers who waited for the opportunity to buy leftovers for next to nothing. Sellers tried to get rid of perishable goods at any cost. Street trading was a one-man show, with the pavement serving as a stage. Success depended on charisma, energy, and the ability to sense the mood of the crowd. It was a cruel but colorful business. Ice cream in Victorian London was an unexpected but popular treat known as hokey pokey. The name came from a distorted Italian phrase meaning, "Here, try this." Italian immigrants brought with them freezing technology and recipes for sweet desserts. Even in winter, ice cream found buyers who wanted to experience the sweet cold. It was sold in special thick-bottom glass cups called penny licks or penny licks. The thick glass created an optical illusion that the portion of ice cream was larger than it actually was. A small ball of sweet mixture was placed in a hollow at the top. The buyer paid a penny, ate or licked the ice cream right at the cart, and returned the cup to the seller. The glass was immediately rinsed in a bucket of water and refilled for the next customer. It was a reusable, eco-friendly cup of that era, although questionable in terms of cleanliness. The ice cream itself was made from milk, sugar, eggs, and starch, freezing the mixture in metal containers surrounded by ice and salt. The texture was not as creamy as modern ice cream, but rather resembled frozen custard. The flavors were simple: vanilla, lemon, and sometimes strawberry. Ice cream carts were brightly painted and often had a canopy to protect from the sun or rain. They were decorated with mirrors and pictures of Italian landscapes. This added an exotic touch and made buying ice cream feel like a little trip to another country. The ice for production was harvested in winter from frozen canals or imported in huge blocks from Norway. Storing ice was a difficult task that required deep cellars and insulation. Therefore, ice cream was a technological miracle available on the street. Despite the cold weather, children and adults alike enjoyed buying this sweet treat. Sugar and fat provided energy, and the unusual sensations distracted from the dullness of everyday life. It was a moment of pure joy for a single coin. The popularity of the Kopeck Lisya was phenomenal. On weekends, queues formed around the carts. People stood waiting for a free cup, anticipating the sweet taste. Over time, due to hygiene concerns, Glass cups were banned and replaced by waffle cones. But the penny lick remained a symbol of an era when pleasure was shared and passed from hand to hand. This dessert shows how much people craved simple pleasures. Even in the harsh conditions of the city, there was always room for a sweet celebration. For those who wanted a really filling and cheap meal, there was pea pudding. It was a thick, dense puree made from overcooked yellow peas. It was cooked in large cauldrons, often with a piece of bacon or ham for flavor. The pudding was so thick that it could be cut with a knife. It was sold in slices or spooned into the buyer's bowl. The dish was sprinkled with salt, pepper, and sometimes dried mint. The hot peas stayed warm for a long time and kept you feeling full for several hours. It was the perfect food for hard physical labor. The taste of pea pudding was simple, earthy, and slightly sweet. The texture was soft and enveloping, which was pleasant in cold weather. It was a plant-based protein that replaced meat for those who could not afford it. Pea pudding was often sold with hot sausages or pieces of boiled pork. This combination was called Savoy and was considered a complete meal. The fat from the meat mixed with the peas, making it even tastier and more nutritious. Vendors selling this dish usually stood near pubs or factory gates. Their customers were people who did not have the time or opportunity to cook at home. Peas were cheap to buy and easy to prepare, which made the business profitable. The second most popular dish was hot oatmeal or liquid porridge. It was poured from large cans early in the morning. It was the cheapest food in town, affordable even to the poorest. Liquid and hot, it warmed you from the inside, spreading warmth throughout your body. Bread was crumbled into it to make it thicker. It was fuel for the poorest, allowing them to survive another day. The smell of boiled peas was thick and recognizable. It was associated with satiety and simple home comfort, even if that comfort was bought on a dirty street. It was the smell of stability. Pea pudding is an example of how the simplest ingredient can be used as the basis of a diet. Without expensive spices or complex technology, people got everything they needed to live. Today, pea pudding has become a traditional side dish, but back then, it was the king of the poor man's table. It was simple, honest food that didn't try to be anything else. Food on a Victorian street was more than just a set of calories. It was a psychological anchor that allowed a person to feel alive. In conditions where there was no heating in the house and clothes were thin and worn, a hot piece of pie or a mug of broth became a source of vitality. People went to street vendors not only to satisfy their hunger, but also to find comfort. Warm food reminded them of a home that many had long since lost. This made every bite especially meaningful. Such food was a small celebration amid the gray everyday life. Even if a person ate standing at a stall, they felt a surge of energy. A hot meal drove away the cold and fatigue, at least for a short time. This moment of warmth became almost the most vivid event of the day. Many workers admitted that it was thanks to street food that they were able to endure their hard shifts. Thus, food was not only nourishment, but also a source of emotional support. Buying food was an act of self-affirmation. A person who could afford to buy a baked potato was not poor. He was a participant in economic life, a respected customer. This boosted self-esteem and gave a sense of dignity. Even the simplest product became proof that a person was still keeping afloat. For many poor people, buying food was a way to prove to themselves that they had not lost control of their lives. They chose what to buy themselves and felt a sense of freedom at that moment. Vendors often knew their regular customers and treated them with respect. This created a sense of belonging and reduced feelings of loneliness. Therefore, each visit to the stall became an act of internal confirmation of one's own significance. Street food created social connections. People met at the same stalls, exchanged news, and got to know each other. It was a street social network that united the residents of the neighborhood. The vendor was the moderator of this communication. Sometimes the conversations turned into real discussions that brightened the beginning or end of the working day. Such meetings gave people a sense of community in a world where everyone was struggling to survive. Some knew each other only from their morning cups of broth, but that was enough to feel a connection. Merchants often served as a source of fresh rumors and events. They heard the conversations of hundreds of people and passed the news on. In this way, street food outlets became centers of local communication. The variety, albeit relative, allowed for choice. Today you could eat oysters, tomorrow peas, the day after tomorrow pie. This illusion of choice was important in a life where much was determined by need and circumstances. Even a small choice gave a sense of control. It allowed a person to feel at least a little free. Street food offered food for different budgets. Those who could afford it bought roasted meat, while those with less money bought potatoes or chestnuts. But the very fact of having a choice gave a sense of participation in city life. People could change their habits and try new things. This variety helped them get through difficult times. Each purchase became a personal decision rather than a necessary step. The smells of food changed the perception of urban space. They overpowered the smell of smoke, horses, and sewage. The aroma of roasted meat or sweet chestnuts made the street more friendly and homely. On cold evenings, the smell of food literally drew people to the stalls. It became a signal that warmth and satiety were nearby. Many followed the smell, even without money, just to feel relief. These aromas created an atmosphere in which the city seemed less harsh. Street vendors seemed to create small oases amid the chaos. Even a brief inhalation of the smell of hot food could lift one's spirits. People said that food made the street come alive. The smells gave hope that one could warm up and survive another day. Hot food was a symbol of care. A mother could buy her child a sweet bun. A husband could bring his wife hot coffee. These were small gestures of love expressed through food. In conditions of poverty, giving food meant giving warmth and strength. Such moments strengthened families and relationships. For some, street food was the only way to please their loved ones. People brought home hot pies to share at dinner. These simple meals became important family moments. The taste of hot food in a cold house was the best reminder of care. Such dishes brought people together, even when life was hard. Even the sight of food being prepared had a calming effect. The steam rising from the pots, the sizzling oil, the golden crust. All of this signaled to the brain, there is food, life goes on. This reduced anxiety and stress. People could stop for a moment just to watch the cooking process. These sounds and smells filled the street with a soothing rhythm. Even without money, people could feel a sense of security. Many workers said that the sight of boiling broth or baking pies gave them strength. It reminded them that the city was still alive and working. People felt a connection to everyday life, which was important for their mental health. Even the simple act of cooking brought a sense of order. It reduced the severity of the surrounding conditions. Street food was democratic. Both a worker and a bankrupt clerk could stand in line for a pie. Hunger made everyone equal, and simple food was understandable to everyone. No one felt like a stranger or an outsider. Vendors served everyone equally, and this created a special atmosphere. This equality made street food an important part of urban culture. Here you could see people from different walks of life. They stood side by side, ate similar dishes, and experienced similar difficulties. This united them and made the street a real social space. Food erased the boundaries between people. The history of Victorian street food is a story of the triumph of spirit over matter. People found joy and pleasure in the simplest things. They knew how to appreciate warmth and taste because they knew the price of their absence. Street food was a small celebration amid poverty and cold. It supported people not only physically but also morally. These dishes gave people the strength to carry on despite the harsh conditions. Simple food became part of the culture of survival. It was accessible, understandable, and necessary for everyone. The flavors of Victorian streets preserved a history of struggle and hope. They showed how much a piece of hot food could mean. Ultimately, it was this simple, hot, fatty food that helped build the modern world. It gave strength to the people who built the bridges, roads, and houses that still stand today. These people worked in difficult conditions, and it was often street food that sustained them. It turned weakness into energy and fatigue into movement. Thus, food became the invisible foundation of the industrial age. And although we rarely think about such things today, back then every hot pie was a small brick in the wall of great progress. People ate on the go, worked until they dropped, and then came back for another helping of warmth. Street food gave them the strength to live each day. Therefore, its role in history is much deeper than it seems at first glance. We strolled through the foggy streets of Victorian London and peeked into the cauldrons and braziers that fed this huge city. From humble baked potatoes to surprising eel jelly, each dish was a response to the challenges of harsh reality. It was survival cuisine, but there was room for ingenuity, warmth, and even a kind of beauty. People managed to find comfort where it seemed impossible. These stories remind us that food is not only about taste, but also about history, economics, and psychology. What seems strange or primitive to us today was the height of pleasure and a guarantee of life for our ancestors. The ability to enjoy the little things is perhaps the main lesson we can learn from the gastronomic past of poor London. What topics would you like to see in future videos on our channel? Perhaps you are interested in the life of sailors or the cuisine of medieval castles? Write your suggestions in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss out on new dives into history.